Are social media and AI ruining the scuba diving industry? Diving for likes, copycats, and straight up manufactured underwater content. It's all become commonplace, and as an underwater filmmaker and an avid social media poster, it seems like an appropriate topic for this DiveSAGA Dive Debrief podcast. I'm your host, underwater filmmaker and scuba instructor trainer, Nick de Rooter. Are social media and AI ruining the scuba diving industry? Kaboom! That's our opening statement for today's episode of the DiveSAGA Dive Debrief podcast. And I'm going to start this episode with a little bit of help from my friend ChatGPT. Hey Chat, can you write me a decompression dive plan for a dive to 80 meters deep? Tell me which bottom gases and deco gases to use and which decompression stops to make. I would like 20 minutes of bottom time.
Can't help you create a specific decompression dive plan, gases plus stop schedule, for an 80 meters, 20-minute dive. That would be technical life support instructions for an extremely hazardous activity. And giving exact gases and stop times could put you in real danger if anything is off. Equipment, physiology, environment, training levels.
That is actually a lot less concerning than I thought it would be. At least for OpenAI's ChatGPT, I'm not able to extract a decompression dive schedule from the AI. So at least for now, there is some type of safety built in, and scuba instructors are not getting replaced immediately, at least as far as learning how to make a decompression schedule is concerned. And that being said, one could of course argue that it is also just possible to purchase decompression software and create your own schedule from there. But I would like to talk a little bit today about the impact of social media on scuba diving, what that means for traditional media, how influencers play into that, collaborations with dive operators, a little bit about conservation, trade shows, good and bad habits, and whether AI can actually do the heavy lifting or replace us altogether as underwater photographers and underwater filmmakers. And maybe not in the least, how do we eventually find a way to marry AI and assume that it's not going away? How do we integrate that into our work without letting it put us out of business? I would like to give a quick thanks to our sponsor, InDepth Magazine. InDepth isn't about gear hype or clickbait, and appropriately, it's completely AI-free as well. It's about real dive stories, real explorers, and real underwater science. If you enjoy this podcast, you'll probably love the kind of long-form articles and photography that they publish. You can find InDepth Magazine online or in print, and by supporting them, you're helping keep serious dive journalism alive. Surf to www.indepthmag.com and start reading and learning for free. You can of course also find a link to InDepth Magazine in the description of this podcast. Social media and AI are not the same, but they're getting more and more intertwined, which is why I have included them both in this one episode, but we will certainly start with social media. For those of you who do know the DiveSAGA channel, you might be aware that this is not just a podcast. If anything, the podcast is complementary to our YouTube channel, where we of course post lots of long-form videos, and to the DiveSAGA Instagram page, where you can find a lot of short form videos and some photos. So we are very heavy into social media, and this is by no means a tirade against the use of social media in scuba diving, but rather a little bit of an examination into how we can use those tools and where they might be posing a little bit of an issue. I think the most important thing to realize when it comes to social media is that traditional media have had to relinquish control. That is the case for almost any industry, but it is certainly also the case for the scuba diving industry, where traditionally, I think a lot of, for instance, training organizations had the real marketing and media power because they had the budgets. A lot of big TV channels or production companies such as National Geographic and BBC, and maybe diving magazines to an extent. But these days, everybody can, of course, create content, as we call it, and everybody can write articles, shoot videos, and publish. What that means is, of course, that you get a much more diversified view on the scuba diving industry, both the good and the bad. But in my personal opinion, I think it's quite exciting that a lot of real explorers, which can be hard to vet, by the way, but there are a lot of really cool scuba diving explorers who have a much easier time getting a platform because they simply have built their own communication channels using Instagram or, for instance, using YouTube. It's not all positive, but I do think in this case, that's a massive positive net outcome of social media, that it's no longer up to certain entities, such as, for instance, the BBC or National Geographic, to declare people an explorer and to give them a platform and to give them all the attention. That doesn't mean, of course, that everybody who's able to market themselves as an explorer is one. I am well aware that there are a fair amount of pretenders online as well. But I do also think that the end consumer of that content is often savvy enough to figure out who's real and who's not. And for a lot of, smaller explorers and exploration groups, this is unprecedented. I think that since the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, they are able to put their work out there and gather support. I think that's beautiful, and I do think that that is a positive outcome of social media in scuba diving. So if you thought that this podcast was going to be all negative, it certainly isn't. I'm going to try to make this as balanced as I possibly can. Of course, there is also the very often lamented issue of influencers asking for free diving or free training. That's absolutely a real thing. I've worked in a dive center for 15 years and we've come across this very, very often. Personally, I don't think that that's a social media issue. I think that's more a personality problem, if you will. On the other hand, I actually think it's amazing for smaller dive operations that now the opportunity exists to actually collaborate with creators of their choice. I think it can be a very positive thing for small dive operators with small advertising budgets. If you want to take out a full page ad in a scuba diving magazine, you're still usually looking at several thousands of euros in expenses, and you could certainly reduce those expenses by going the other route and working with people who can give you proper exposure on their channels. So I don't think that's a bad thing, assuming that it originates from the dive operator. Again, it goes back to what we mentioned earlier, where traditional media had to relinquish control a little bit for the benefit of smaller creators, and in this case also for the benefit of smaller operators. I don't know if you agree, but I certainly have seen it happen multiple times that people will make purchasing choices, both for equipment, but also for dive operations, dive travel, based on what they see on social media. You might say, well, that could be deceptive, or that could be, they might not necessarily be the most informed consumers if they base themselves on social media posts, but that is also true for traditional advertising, of course. If you base your purchasing decision on a full page ad in a scuba diving magazine, I don't think that that's necessarily a more informed decision than basing yourself on the content of a creator that you follow and that you consider trustworthy. At the same time, I also think that conservation has benefited greatly from social media. I think that there is some great education and outreach out there, and people are really pouring their hearts and souls into creating nice content about sustainable diving practices, for instance. Of course, accuracy can be an issue because, once again, everybody can publish anything. But considering the fact that many conservation organizations often work with very small or no budgets, and social media being, of course, a relatively cheap, if not free way of spreading your content, I think that this is an amazing way to spread awareness and to at least try and educate the general diving public about positive diving practices and about positive projects that are being conducted around the globe. Now, I am aware that it seems like I'm being overly positive, perhaps, about the opportunities that social media offer to the scuba diving industry, but I will even go one step further in saying that I think that they're not even yet fully leveraged enough. For instance, if you've ever attended a scuba diving trade show, then I think you might agree that those formats, for instance, are relatively unchanged for the last 30, 40 years. They're just large halls with booths where dive operators will advertise and sell basically their product. And surprisingly, the major trade shows on the planet don't really leverage social media all that much, even though social media has the opportunity to be an almost permanent trade show. So it is somewhat strange, perhaps, that those entities that organize those trade shows don't really leverage social media throughout the year to keep that presence that they try to build while it is physically happening, that they don't leverage that throughout the year. I do think that's an interesting thought experiment. You might, of course, say, well, maybe trade shows are dying because of social media. I think there's a way to marry the two in a very smart way. Not in the least because I do think that eventually social media will only be valuable if there is a real life component to it. And more about that later when we get to the AI topic as well. Of course, there are also some serious drawbacks. I mentioned them in the intro, but diving for clicks or diving for likes can, of course, be a real issue. Now, first off, I do think that anything that gets people outside and anything that gets people diving is good, even if their reason is to create content, as we call it. I do the same, right? I often go scuba diving specifically to shoot a DiveSAGA episode. That is not in any way superior to somebody who goes scuba diving to create an Instagram reel if that's what they like doing. But of course, proper diving practices in that are extremely important, and I think that's where a lot of people's grievances are with social media, is that a lot of divers have become these barely certified individuals who got 2-3 day open water training and then dive with GoPros on selfie sticks and ruin the reef, so to speak. If we look at that, let's say, cliche image of a social media diver, then I of course fully agree that that is probably not the direction we want to go. But there is something to be said for a need in curriculum change. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you think about this, but I think that training agencies are a little bit behind on the trend, because I still do not see any of this type of awareness being integrated into an entry-level curriculum. And I do think there is a real role there for instructors to train divers on not only responsible interaction with aquatic life, which is it's present in most curriculums, but the filming aspect, the social media aspect, the GoPro, etc., etc. Because whether you agree or disagree that a certified open water diver should immediately be diving with a camera, it's actually irrelevant. I disagree as well. I do think that after 4 training dives or what have you, it's probably way too soon to give your attention to the camera. But realistically, nothing can really stop people from doing that after training. So prevention and education is then probably extremely relevant. And I think that it makes perfect sense to integrate this in an entry-level curriculum, not to dissuade people from doing it, but teaching them the ways in which they are dividing their attention between their scuba diving skills, which are very new, and their filming skills, which, let's be honest, are usually really not that good. But it is important to include that. Of course, at the end of the day, I think it all boils down to whether the content that we are exposed to, whether it promotes good or bad diving habits. And there again, I do in general, at least on my feed, and of course all feeds are curated personally, so it is very possible that each and every one of you listening has a very different experience. But in general, my feed, I see 90% quite good diving habits, and that's possible because maybe my friends list or my following list is full of divers that I admire or that I personally know and dive with or train with, or who trained with me. So maybe I'm a little bit in that bubble, but I think that at least in scuba diving, it's quite exceptional that, and maybe this is the same in other disciplines, I don't know, because to be honest, scuba diving is kind of my only organized sports that I do. But I do feel like the content that sort of floats to the top and is somewhat popular usually contains examples of good diving behavior. And then I mean, for instance, really nice trim, proper use of equipment, really things to aspire to the point where I would even argue that maybe, and this is then the flip side, maybe it's almost a little bit toxic. What do I mean by that? I very often get students, and again, it's a good thing, but it could be toxic, students who have these examples of divers they admire, content they found on Instagram, but of course everybody can hover perfectly in trim without moving anything for, let's say, 10 seconds, right? And even more so in a still photo. But it's fairly easy to create if you are properly skilled. I'm not detracting from these people's skills, but if you're properly skilled, it is fairly easy to create a reel that looks absolutely perfect. Real diving, though, is of course not always perfect. Conditions aren't always perfect. And while it is good, don't get me wrong, that people aspire to be so, let's say, fantastically in trim, to be so cave aware, wreck aware, etc. That's amazing. I'm not saying that you shouldn't aspire to do that, but it certainly puts a lot of initial pressure on the student if they think that that's going to happen immediately. Of course, there again, the instructor role I think is simply important, is to provide context. Yes, this is achievable, this is desirable, but it takes work, right? Most of those divers, and again, there are amazing creators that are popular, especially on Instagram, for instance, as well as TikTok, where they do go out of their way to post proper content and proper diving skills, and I think that is absolutely commendable. These are probably the people that really lift up the industry, maybe even more so than the training agencies at the moment. I don't know if that's a controversial statement. You can also let me know in the comments, but I do think that some very dedicated, high-performing social media influencers, for lack of a better word, sometimes give us better minimums to aspire to than many of the training agencies and their content, if you will. But again, it's of course, context is everything, right? It's important to dive in proper trim. It's important to have your equipment configured properly, but it is also, of course, important to realize that that takes time to achieve, that takes training. Let's shift over to artificial intelligence, to AI for a minute. As I mentioned earlier, social media and AI are becoming more and more intertwined, to the point where I think the new video and image generator Sora 2, I think, has an built-in social media platform. So it's literally meant for generating what I would call AI slop, and then it sort of immediately ends up on your feed, and basically you're just scrolling through AI slop. You might find that entertaining. I'm not here to be a judge of that. But of course, it clashes aggressively with what, for instance, we try to do on the DiveSAGA channel, and with what many scuba diving content creators do try to do, which is, of course, to show not only our skills, but to show the planet, right? And to show real things. The good news for now, at least, is that I haven't seen AI really able to replicate scuba gear, for instance, just yet. BCDs and regulators still often are a weird mess of corrugated hoses and regulators that are sitting in the wrong place, or masks that are not in the right spot. So anybody who knows scuba diving can still look at an image and almost immediately identify it as AI generated. Of course, non-scuba trained individuals who do not know what scuba gear looks like might have a little bit of a harder time identifying that. So, and whether they can or can't it is coming. Eventually, AI will be able to replicate that in a very credible way. And that is, I think, is the topic of the moment, right? Are we still going to be able to differentiate real from artificial intelligence? And the answer is probably no, eventually, although I do think there are some interesting shifts that will happen in that regard. Additionally, a discussion that I often hear is to what extent you should allow yourself to use AI as a photo or video assistant, right? For that, I like to rewind a little bit to, for instance, when Photoshop and Lightroom became popular. And even to this day, there is still that argument of Photoshop versus real photography. A lot of photographers will make that a hill they're willing to die on, that the photo needs to be untouched. Of course, even if you shoot analog photo, there is manipulation happening. As soon as you develop a film, you're manipulating it. And the question is simply, how far do you want that process of manipulation to go? When you get to Photoshop, to color correction, is that where you draw the line? Backscatter removal, is that where you draw the line? But then why not use an AI tool to remove backscatter? That being said, many photo contests, for instance, will still ask for the raw file. Sometimes they'll allow some touch-ups but still want the raw file, sometimes no touch-ups allowed. So I'm not here to be the judge of that, but there is of course a very interesting debate that can take place about how much AI is then allowed in photography. And it becomes a bit Theseus ship, I think, where if we remove one board of a wooden ship, is it still the same ship? And you would reasonably argue yes. If you replace more than 50% of the wood on a ship, is it still the same original ship? And if all the wood has been replaced, is it still the same ship? And so you might draw the line in different places there. But so how much manipulation and how much AI would you allow on a photo before it's no longer the original photo? And I've done it myself, of course, here and there, where maybe something in the background doesn't sit quite well or isn't the cleanest. You can either stamp, clone that, or you can simply circle it and tell AI to get rid of it. So those options do already exist and people do already use those options. It's simply a question of how much you allow yourself to use and how far you would go in that before you no longer consider it an original photo. Now, of course, photos that are created from scratch, in my opinion, are completely useless. We are seeing many environments that are completely made up, and I fall for it sometimes because as part of the DiveSAGA channel, I'm often looking for those diving locations that are unusual, that are out there, you know, think sunken cities or weird caves and whatnot. And yeah, it's really hard. Sometimes I find photos of things and I think, oh my God, this is an episode. We need to go there. We need to make this happen, only to find out that it looks nothing like that. And the picture that I fell for was AI. So this is happening more and more. It's actually making research a little bit difficult sometimes. But the same thing is also happening in reverse, where people will look at DiveSAGA episodes and, or more so at reels, I would say, because they're shorter and they are lacking context often, but they will see a 10 or 15 second clip of something from a DiveSAGA episode and they will call it AI. The first time I started seeing that was during a dive or after a dive in Felicitas mine in Germany, where we really did put a lot of effort, team effort, in getting some beautiful shots. For those of you who want to see that episode, I'll put it below. It's basically we're a team of 4 divers. We go down into Felicitas mine. So this is 30 meters deep and then a few hundred meters from the entrance in overhead environment. Water's pretty cold. I don't remember the exact temperature, but it's certainly dry suit and thick thermal exposure. So it's and it was a scooter dive, so for all intents and purposes, not a super simple dive, with an entire lighting plan of one diver holds, 60,000 lumens in the corner here, one diver holds 20,000 lumens above the model, we staged some lights. So it's a relatively complex shoot that we were fairly proud of, only for then several viewers, especially on the reel of the isolated shot of a diver hovering above a saw blade that's stuck in a wall, only for several viewers to call it out as what they thought was AI. And that is, of course, the real danger that we're getting into, is that the more and more AI generated content appears that we're not able to label as such, the more there will also be confusion as to whether real content is maybe fake or not. And that is, of course, a little bit sad, especially if you are a content creator or an underwater filmmaker or photographer, or whatever title you want to give yourself, is that everything can be created with the press of a button. And so the question is, how do you still differentiate yourself? And so I think ultimately the real question is, of course, how do we find a way to either coexist or embrace AI? Because you can fight it, but I think that is a moot point, as we all can see. But the question is, of course, how do we use it to our advantage, and how do we let it not make us as underwater filmers, photographers go extinct, right? I think a lot of that simply starts with proper use. I think, for instance, a lot of that you can see when you look at the captions of Instagram posts. A lot of people will now just use ChatGPT or some kind of AI to write their captions. It's very easy to identify. Often it's full of emojis, not that emojis are the main identifier. I'll often use emojis, but chat definitely does that. It almost bullet points with emojis. And then those M dashes. I think everybody's slowly getting aware of that. Those slightly longer dashes than you would normally use. Humans simply do not elect to use those for captions, and ChatGPT does it all the time. Not to mention that most of the time the captions will sound pretty generic. I'm not saying you can't do it, but I think it's dangerous, especially if you're a larger content creator, or if you're a diving business, a dive center, dive retailer, for instance. I do think that people feel whether you're really speaking to them or whether it is AI, whether it is a non-existing entity. Maybe they can't immediately identify it as such on an individual post, but I think overall you are damaging your brand identity and your consumer trust if your voice is no longer unique. So I think there, by all means, use AI as a writing assistant. I often use it as a writing assistant, but I will never use ChatGPT or similar AI generated content as is on social media. It's very dangerous, I think, and I think people can feel it. So that is one way I think that we can create a little bit of what I would call AI hygiene, right? Where you simply know how much to use and how much not to use. I'm still figuring that out as well. I'm not trying to be here holier than thou. In fact, as recently as last week, I had a Scuba Science episode go up with, it was about Archimedes' principle, and I had absolutely no idea how to create a thumbnail about Archimedes' principle, right? The force that decides whether objects sink or float. And so I thought it'd be cute to have Archimedes in scuba gear in a bathtub, as Archimedes reportedly famously came up with his principle while sitting in a bathtub. And immediately within the first few hours, a viewer called out in the comments that that was lazy, that the thumbnail, being so obviously AI, was very lazy, and that it gave at least the impression that we did no effort for the video itself. And I actually respect that. I did change it afterwards. I appreciate when viewers give this type of feedback, especially when it's warranted. And I knew what I was doing when I was experimenting with AI for the thumbnail. But I think that's a very positive sign that people do actually, they will measure your willingness to provide quality with the amount of AI you use, I think. And so I actually really want to thank that viewer for speaking up so honestly, because that's a good example of a place where I used AI and maybe shouldn't have, or where I'm still learning to do that. Lastly, I think the most important question is, of course, where do we go from here? And for me, the answer, And I already had this idea instinctively, but I saw it a few days ago very clearly laid out in a post by Gary Vaynerchuk. If you don't know, Gary V is what he's often called. He's probably one of the most prolific posters on social media on the planet. You can definitely go look him up. I think he does something like 500 posts per day across all his platforms. Maybe way too much, and I'm not saying that he is something that we should all emulate, but he did have a take on where do we go from social media and AI, where does that go afterwards, and he's been right so far about almost every development in the social media space in the last 15 years. And his take is that from here, we will most likely go back to at least having a real life component, a real life experience component to social media for it to be validated as human made. And what that means is that if you are simply an AI account and if you simply post AI slop, yes, that will become difficult to verify and to recognize, but humans will instinctively start craving the knowledge that it is real, knowing that it is made by humans, knowing that humans are doing those crazy or beautiful things. And so it makes perfect sense that we probably will evolve or come full circle really from something that started in the real world, scuba diving in this case, that then slowly started living an online life, and that now that online life has become so difficult to verify that more and more people will actually crave a real life component to it. So for instance, can I meet this person, right? If you're following explorers, you might think, is that person real? Can I meet them somewhere? Which is, by the way, where trade shows can once again become a real thing. People do already often lead their own dive travels or expeditions, as they sometimes call them, because that sounds way cooler. I do that too, by the way. So definitely no offense. But I think that is the real saving grace eventually, that people will want to know that what they're following and what they're admiring and what they're perhaps aspiring to is real. And so the verification, the validation of whether it is fake or reality will have to happen in person. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. That also just solves, I think, the whole social media issue that of good versus bad habits, because the people that tend to do it right and the people that tend to have a professional approach do tend to float to the surface, no pun intended. And if you couple that with presence at trade shows or organizing your own expeditions or the ability to learn from organizing courses, etc., I think that is going to be the real test as to whether somebody is real or fake and worth following or not. So let me know what you think, but that's my 2 cents on the whole AI and even social media debate. Let me know in the comments as well if you think that training agencies should maybe step up their game a little bit in training a little bit more camera, GoPro, social media awareness in their entry-level courses, because at the end of the day, people are going to do that after certification, so we might as well train them a little bit in how to do it responsibly. I would also like to know what your feeds look like. Do you see more good than bad habits on your feed, or am I the only one who lives in a bubble? Let me know that in the comments below. I also want to thank the sponsor of this episode, which was InDepth Magazine. So you can surf to www.indepthmag.com and you can read their magazine for free. Really good long-form articles and serious diving journalism. And let me leave you with one reassurance. This was a real podcast. It was not an AI voice. I recorded it myself, and I will be very happy to see you soon in our next episode of the DiveSAGA Dive Debrief podcast. Thank you for listening. See you soon.